So we're now up to Daf Yud Aleph, Amud Beis. Rabbi Eliezer Amar b'peh rach, with a soft mouth. That means the Paro began to enslave the Jewish people by encouraging them with words, with good pay, to work for them. He gathered the Israelites, and would they do him a favor? He took a basket of clay and a trowel of started laying bricks. The Israelites enthusiastically helped him with their brickwork. By the end of the day, Paro ordered his taskmasters to count the number of bricks that had been laid, and he then demanded they produce the same amount every day. This was Paro's first attempt to halt the population increase of the Israelites. The taskmasters would advise the Israelites not to go home, but rather to sleep at the work site so they could fulfill their quota the next day. However, this did not arrest the propagation of the Jews, as the verse states, but as much as they would afflict it, so it would increase. The Bnei Yisrael began first to work for Paro when Yaakov died, actually. All right. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani Omar, b'pricha, with crushing labor. Omar Rava b'tchila b'chomer b'levenim. First, they embittered the lives of Bnei Yisrael with mortar and with bricks. Uvasot b'chol avoda b'sodah, with every labor in the field. Working in the field is more demeaning than construction work. So the Egyptians subjugated the Israelites even more by forcing them to perform menial labor in the fields. Es kol avodosam asher avdu behem befareth. Amar Rab Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rab Yonasan. Shahoyu machlifim melochan melechas anoshim lenoshim v'melechas noshim leanoshim. So men were given the work of women, women were given the work of men. They would order the men to knead the dough and bake the bread. The women would have to chop wood and draw water. This made the work more difficult for them. And even though the men were used to exerting themselves even harder to perform physical labor, it was difficult for them to do tasks that they had never done before, were unfamiliar with. Even though they were less physically taxing, and the women certainly suffered by being forced to perform labor that was more strenuous than that which was normal for them. But I think this is much deeper than that in terms of the switch between the men and the women. Right, so it says perach befarech, and we're interpreting it as perach. And that means that the work began with a soft mouth. And here the term parach means with crushing labor. So let's just... It says here, Vayavidu Mitzrayim es b'nei Yisrael befarach. And that's Pasuk Yud Gimel. And now we're looking at es kol havoda asher avdu behem befarach. And this is Pasuk Yud Daled. So the previous Pasuk was Pasuk Yud Gimel. So befarach appears twice. So that even those machlokas about how to interpret the befarach in the original Pasuk Yud Gimel, however, with regard to the second befarach in Pasuk Yud Daled, everyone agrees that it should be taken literally as crushing labor. Dorash Rav Avira, B'schar noshim tzidkol Yosha Yavi also ador nigalu Yisrael miMitzrayim. When the women would go out to draw water, Kadosh Baruch Hu mizamin lehem dogim k'tane b'chadeim. God would prepare small fish for them in their jugs, v'shavos, mechza mayim, umechza dogim. They would draw up with their jugs half water and half fish, ubos, v'shoftos, shtei kaderos, achas shel chamen, v'achas shel dogim, umolichos, eitzel, baleim l'sada. They would come and place 2 pots on top of the oven. One was a pot full of hot water, and one was full of the fish. And they would take these 2 pots, and they would bring them to the husbands in the field. Marchitzos oson v'sachos oson. They would bathe their husbands and anoint them. Umachilos oson, mashkos oson. They give them food to eat and water to drink. V'nis kakos lembein shvatayim. And they would have a union with them in the borders of the fields. Shenemar, as the pasuk indicates in Tehillim, im tishkevun bein shvatayim, as you lie amongst the borders. The women would also, Rashi says in Parshas Pekudei, arouse the men with copper mirrors. Each woman would view herself with her husband in the mirror and entice him by saying, "I'm more handsome than you." The mirrors were later used to fashion the kiyar in the Mishkan, even though Moshe initially refused to take them. Hashem said, "These are most precious." Every field had a raised border marking its boundary, and the low land between 2 such borders offered relative privacy. So since the women stayed faithful to their husbands and supported them, Bnei Yisrael merited to be saved. B'schar tishkevun bein sfatayim. And this is the pasuk again of lie amongst, between the borders. And what was the reward for this? That pasuk in Tehillim, Zoch Yisrael bizas Mitzrayim. They merited the spoils of Egypt. Shenemar kanfei yono nechpa b'kesef v'evrosea b'rakrak chorutz. So this is the end of the same pasuk in Samach Ches of Tehillim. As you lie amongst the borders, and the wings of a dove that are coated with silver and her pinions with brilliant gold. And Klal Yisrael is compared to the dove, to the kanfei, to the Yonah, and Israel was loaded with gold and silver spoils of Egypt. This is the Bizas Mitzrayim. Now, why were they granted the spoils of Mitzrayim? Is it a schar for their work in building Pharaoh's storage cities, or is it in the merit of the women? And he asks a question here, why was any merit needed if God had already promised Avram v'achrei chen yetzer rechush gadol? And he quotes the Mishnah. Hashem's promise to Avram was predicated on the assumption that Bnei Yisrael would be enslaved for 400 years. In fact, their entire stay in Egypt was only 210 years. 2 factors contributed to view the shorter amount of time as a fulfillment of the 400-year term. 1, the harshness of the work, and 2, the tremendous number of Bnei Yisrael who worked due to the tremendous increase in population. So the Gemara states that the hard labor of building Pharaoh's storage cities enabled the Bnei Yisrael to gain the spoils of Egypt, even though the 400 years were not fulfilled. Well, our Gemara adds that through the efforts of the women of Israel, Bnei Yisrael continued to procreate, and therefore their term was lessened. This factor allowed them to receive Bizas Mitzrayim at an earlier date. The Kevad Shemis Abros, when the women of Israel became pregnant, Bos Levatayim, they would come to their houses And because it was a time of sorrow for Klal Yisrael, they did not further cohabit with their husbands. The Kevan Shemagia Zman Moladeim, when the time came for them to give birth, Holchos v'Yoldos b'Sotah tachas tapuach. They would give birth in the field under the apple tree. I don't know if tapuach means apple, but in any event, and this is indicative of a pasuk, alludes to a pasuk in Shir Shirim Perek Beis, where coming closer to Hashem is compared to an apple tree that desired to receive His Torah. Shenemar tachas hatapuach oraticha, and the pasuk says that they would go and give birth in the field under the apple tree. I roused you. According to this explanation, this drasha, the pasuk means that God aroused the children to leave their mother's wombs under the apple tree. And then it says, Shama chiblascha imecha shama chibla yiladasach. There your mother was in travail for you, she bore you, and was in travail. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Sholeach Mishmei Marom, He sent from the heavens, Misha Menakir Meshaper Osam, an angel that would clean the newborn babies and straighten out the limbs of the children, which became dislocated as a result of the trauma of birth. Like the midwife who straightens out the child. As the pasuk says in Yechezkel Hanavi Moladet Tayech, B'yom Huledes Osach Lo Koras Sharech Ubemayim Lo Ruchatz Lemish'i. In regard to your birth, on the day that you were born, your umbilical cord was not cut, nor you washed with water to smooth the skin. So this is a description of the birth of Israel as a nation in Mitzrayim. There were no midwives to cut the umbilical cord or to otherwise care for the newborns. These tasks were performed by the angels that were sent by the Almighty Malakit Lahem Shnei Igulim. The angel would gather for the babies 2 round loaves. Echad shel shemen v'echad shel dvash, one of oil and one of honey. They would gather stones for the babies, from which they were miraculously able to suck out oil and honey. Shenemar, as the pasuk says in Dvarim at the end of the Chumash, Vayenikeyu dvash misela v'sheman. He would suckle him with honey from a stone and oil from a flinty rock. When the Egyptians would discover the babies, they would come to kill them, and asalem nes v'nivloim b'karka. The babies were swallowed up in the ground miraculously. The Mitzrayim would bring oxen and plow on top of them. So they saw that the babies were saved miraculously, but nevertheless they made an attempt to kill the babies by plowing over them. Shenemar, as the pasuk says in Tilim, Kuf Chof Tes. Al Gabi Chorshu Chorshim, on my back the plow is plowed. Liacha Shahol Lichan Shaholchim, after the Egyptians went away, the babies would spring out like the grass of the field. Shenemar, as the pasuk says in Yechezkel Hanavi, Revava Kitzemach Hasod Tzatich, I made you as numerous as the plants of the field. And this verse is interpreted to mean that they grew out of the ground like plants in the field. The Kevan Shemiskadlim Boim Adorim Levateim. When the children grew up, they would come as flocks upon flocks to their houses. Shenemar, again further in Yechezkel Hanavi, Vatirbi Vatigdali Vatavo Biade Adayim. You increased and grew, and you came with ornaments upon ornaments. Al Tikre Ba'ade Adayim. Don't read it that way, but Ba'ade Adayim as ornaments upon ornaments, but rather read it Ela Be'edre Adorim, flocks upon flocks. Ukshenigla HaKadosh Baruch Hu al Hayom, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealed himself at the Yam Suf, Heim Hikiru Tchila. These children recognized God first. Shedemar Zeh Kelim Yaveru. Now, how does that come from Zeh Kelim Yaveru? Because they had already witnessed the divine presence. So it made sense that they would be the first to recognize him with a capital H. So Paro's first plan was to prevent the Israelites from procreating, and that was foiled. Now, he tried a new tactic, and that is tried to destroy the Jewish children. Rabu Shmuel Chadamar Isho Bita. It was a woman with her daughter. Chadamar Kala v'chamosa. It was a daughter-in-law with her mother-in-law. Either combination satisfies the requirement that one woman be primary, a mother or a mother-in-law, and the second was secondary, a daughter or a daughter-in-law. Mandi Omar Ishu Bita, a woman and a daughter is Yocheved Miriam. Umandi Omar Kal v'chamosa Yocheved ve'Elisheva. Elisheva was the daughter of Aminadav, who married Aaron, Yocheved's second son. Elisheva was thus Yocheved's future daughter-in-law. Now, it's unlikely that Miriam was one of the midwives, since she was only 5 years old at that time. Therefore, the pasuk must refer to Elisheva, who was the only other woman of the time named in the Torah. And she was secondary to her future mother-in-law, Yocheved. Aaron was only 2 years old at the time. We must presume that Elisheva was older than him and thus could serve as a midwife. Tanya Kamandi Omar Isho Bita. So now we're going to support the view of either Rav or Shmuel that it was Yocheved Miriam, the Sanya from a Bryce. Shifra Zo Yocheved, V'lo Shma. Shifra Shemishaper Sesavla. She straightens out the limbs of the child after birth. Davar Acher Shifra Sheparu V'Ravu Yisrael B'Yomel. That during her days the people of Israel increased and multiplied. Pua Zu Miriam. So the midwife called Pua in the pasuk is actually Miriam. V'lo Shma Pua Shahoisa Poa Lavlad. She would make sweet sounds like pua, poo, poo, poo. Davar acher pua shaisa poa baruch hakodesh. Pua means she would cry out with the divine spirit. V'omeres asida imi shetele ben shemoshias Yisrael. So it was actually Miriam who prophesied that her mother would give birth to the son who would save Israel. Vayomer b'yad lechem es ha'ivrios. So Paro gave instructions to the midwives: when you are assisting the Hebrew women at childbirth, you see on the stones, if it was a son, you're to kill him. If it's a daughter, you shall live. She shall live. Mayov Nayim. What does it mean, the stones? Rab Chanan, Simon Gadol Mosalehem. Paro gave the great sign of imminent childbirth. So that the mothers would not give birth in their absence, hide the babies, and claim they had miscarried. When a woman kneels to give birth, her thighs become cold as stones. A woman is generally in labor for a period of time before giving birth. Paro gave the midwives a sign so that they would know when the actual childbirth was imminent. He told the midwives that when the mother's thighs become cold, it's time to take the baby out, and if it's a male, kill the baby. Another explanation of these stones of Naim is based on a pasuk in Yirmiyahu, Va'ered beis hayotzer vehinehu osem malach alav Naim. I went down to the house of the potter, and he was doing work over the stones, over the block. My Yotzer said, just like a potter, he has a thigh here and a thigh here with a block in the middle. Yerech mikan v'sadon ba'emtza. And the potter's block is a thick piece of wood, which the potter straddles, sits and rolls clay balls of different sizes upon it before placing them in various molds that he uses. Is af isha, a woman is giving birth. Yorech mikan v'yorech mikan v'avla b'emtza. So I hear and if I there, the child is in the middle. So she assumes the same position as a potter when she straddles the birthing stone. Upon giving birth, her birth stool is called by the same term as the potter's block. In Beinu v'amitem also, if it's a son, you are to kill him. Amar Rabbi Chanina, Simon Gadol Mosalahem. He gave the midwives a great and dependable sign of the gender of the baby. So they would be able to determine the gender of the child while the mother was sitting on the birth stool, even without having to touch the child. Bain panav lamata. A son's face is turned towards downward at birth. Bas, a daughter, panel lamala. Her face is turned upwards. He says here in the footnote, this sign is no longer reliable because nowadays babies of either gender are born facing both upward and downward. Paro wanted the midwives to kill the babies before the actual birth so the mothers would not realize what had occurred. He therefore gave them a way of recognizing whether or not the child was a boy when it was just beginning to emerge from the womb. But Tirena, Amalyaldos, Esalukim, the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt spoke to them. So the Gemara asks the question, when it says here in the pasuk, Kasher diber aleihem. What's aleihem? Lahen miboile. Should have said lahen. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, Malamed shetva'on lidvar avera. Below nitvu. Pharaoh propositioned them for adultery. He hoped to establish this relationship with them so that there would be a greater chance of their carrying out his orders. But they did not accept his propositioning. They didn't even consider the possibility, even momentarily, decided against it. But they kept the boys alive. Tana, we learned in a brisa. Lo dayan shelo misu osan. It's not enough that the midwives did not kill the boys. Ela shayu maspikos lahen mayim umazon. They supplied water and food for them as well. Vatomarna amialdos el paro kilo kanashim. The midwife comes to them, they've given birth already. My chayos, ilema chayos mamish. If you translate it literally as actual midwives, and the midwives were telling Paro that all the Jewish women were skilled midwives themselves and did not require assistance. That's an untenable interpretation. Even a midwife needs certainly another midwife to give birth. So how can the midwives defend themselves with such an argument? This nation is compared to a wild animal. And chaya means a wild animal. And the Gemara is going to try to find biblical sources to prove that Yisrael is compared to wild beasts. And therefore the babies were born even before any midwife arrived. Yehuda Gur Aryeh, Dani Don Nachash, Naftali Ayola Shlucha, Yisachar Chamar Goren, Yosef Bechar Shar, Binyamin Ze'ev Yitrof, the Siv Bey. So those Shvatim at whom the metaphor is written, it's written of Loksiv Bey, and even those tribes about which a metaphor to an animal is not written, nevertheless, Siv. We have another pasuk in Yechezkel Hanavi, Ma Imcha Levia Ben Arroyos Rovtza, referring to the Jewish nation as a whole, how your mother was a lioness crouching amongst lions. The midwives therefore claimed, just as beasts do not require midwives, the Israel women do not require them. Once the midwives defied Pharaoh's orders, Hashem enabled the Israelite women to give birth without the need for midwives. And this served to protect the Hebrew midwives from Pharaoh's anger when he discovered that they had not carried out his orders. They could truthfully say that the births had taken place without the benefit of a midwife. Pharaoh believed that story because he knew that the women would go out to the fields to bear children. Vayehi ki yoru amiyaldos elokim vayaslem batim Rabu Shmuel, Chad Omar Bate Kahuna Levia, V'Chad Omar Bate Malchus. Mandi Omar Bate Kahuna Levia, Aaron Moshe. That's Aaron is Kahuna and Levia is Moshe. Umandi Omar Bate Malchus, David Nami Me Miriam Ka'asi. And how do we know that David was a descendant of Miriam? David representing Malchus, Dichsiv. We have a pasuk in Divrei Yomi. Vatamas Azuva, who is the wife of Kalev, Vayikach lo Kalev es Ephras. Vateu lo es Chur. And Ephras is a reference to Miriam Uksiv, with David ben Yishai Ephrasi. David was the son of an Ephrathite man. David was the son of a man who traced his lineage back to Ephrat, namely to Miriam. The Kolev ben Chetzron holidus azuva ish of es Yerios, the Ele banel Yesher, the Shovov, the Ardon. So Kolev in this pasuk is referred to as ben Chetzron. In fact, the Gemara ben Yefunahu, he was the son of Yefuna. And this we know from Bamidbar Perkid Gimel. Ben Sheponim Atzas Meraglim. His father's name was really Chetzron. He was called Ben Yefuna because Kalev was a son who turned aside from the plot of the spies. Vakati ben Knazu. I don't get it. Kalev was not the son of Chetzron, but rather the son of Knaz, the Siv. And the Pasuk testifies that in Sefer Yoshua and in Sefer Shoftim, Vayilkada Asnil ben Knaz Achi Kalev, Amarava Chorgo de Knaz Havi. He was a stepson of Knaz. And Kalev and Asnil were maternal brothers. And finally, on Daf Yud Beis, and with this we'll conclude, Tekonami Tichsiv Haknizi, Kalev ben Yefuna Haknizi. Kalev is called the Knizi, not the son of Knaz, implying that Kalev was from the general household of Knaz, but he was not Knaz's biological son. Shma Mina, we see that Kalev was only a stepson of Knaz. And the Gemara is going to go through the Pasuk in Divrei Yomim, line by line, word by word. And that's on Daf Yud Beis. So let me take this opportunity to wish you a Moadim L'Simcha, and thank you so much.